And the voices, they call me by name. Jesus.
You're sure it's God? You're sure it's not the devil?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Get out of there! Get out of the way! This is not your business! Do you want to get hurt?
You hear what he said, idiot? Move!
Which one of you people has never sinned? Listen to me. It's me the prophets preached about. Make a miracle for us. The Messiah doesn't need miracles. He is the miracle. Now he's here. Are you ready for me?
You made better crosses than speeches.
What are you laughing at? Everything you have is going to burn.
And he put his hands on me, and I opened my eyes, and I was baptized and became Paul. It's about Jesus of Nazareth. He was not the son of Mary, he was the son of God. His mother was a virgin, and the angel Gabriel came down and put God's seed in her womb. That's how he was born. And he was punished for our sins.
Did you ever see this Jesus of Nazareth after he came back from the dead? I mean, with your own eyes.
No, but I saw a light that blinded me, and I heard his voice.
You're a liar.
I don't care whether you're Jesus or not. The resurrected Jesus will save the world, and that's what matters.
Those are lies. You can't save the world by lying.
I created the truth out of what people needed and what they believed. If I have to crucify you to save the world, then I'll crucify you. And if I have to resurrect you, then I'll do that too, whether you like it or not.
I won't let you. I'll tell everyone the truth.
You started all this, now you can't stop it.
How can you presume? How can I presume? Because I'm the end of the old law and the beginning of the new one.
Watch what you say.
When I say I, Rabbi, I'm saying God.
That's blasphemy. Didn't they tell you?
I'm the saint of blasphemy. Don't make any mistakes. I didn't come here to bring peace. I came to bring a sword.
Talking like that will get you killed.
An appropriate introduction for this week's show. A delicious collage from The Last Temptation of Christ. This might be your last temptation too, as we provide the latest and last episode from our series, The Christ Myth, Theory, and Its Problems. This is part 4 and the Endgame. I couldn't think of a more appropriate astral guest than Richard Carrier, who incarnates at an agora of the virtual Alexandria to discuss his latest book on the historicity of Jesus, why we might have reason to doubt. For those of you who cannot wait to hear Richard's Gnosis, I would suggest you forward it to, around minute 13 or 14.
My time is precious. You're wasting it.
So, how and why did you yourself materialize at the virtual Alexandria? You were drawn here by the call of the Aeons. Or perhaps you just mistyped Aeon Flux on Google. But here you are, no accident, as you have entered the desert of the real to the oasis of Aeon by Gnostic Radio. Always broadcast through the God above God dat can.
By the power of truth, I, while living, have conquered the universe.
I am Abraxas in his meat machine incarnation of Miguel Connor. Just like you are an avatar of this terrible God above God as the ancients knew him. I am a midwifer of contraband truths and impossible secrets. I am your Pompatus of Gnosis, and you are as well, as your feedback and takeaways invigorate my own Gnosis. That knowledge of the heart, as Valentine has called it.
You're all individuals! Yes! We're all individuals!
Remember one thing. It's not Gnosis unless you give it away. It's not Gnosis unless you give it away. Or as the Gospel of Thomas saying 70 explains, when you give rise to that which is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not give rise to it, What you do not have will destroy you.
Talk about something called a soul's high adventure.
Follow your bliss. I mean, find where it is and don't be afraid to follow it.
And it was Mark Twain who said, "The two most important days in your life are the day you were born and the day you find out why." You find out why you were born here at Aeon by Gnostic Radio. How do you do that exactly? William Volman in the New York Times tells us while describing the Nag Hammadi text, quote, "As a corpus, the scriptures are nearly incoherent, like a crowd of sages, mystics, and madmen, all speaking at once. But always they call upon us to know ourselves. In other words, only fearless self-knowledge will grant you the personal and heroic reason of why you were born. And no one exercised better the power of self-knowledge than the Gnostics. No one dissipated the many counterfeit spirits within and the many false realities outside better than the Gnostics. Overcame all last temptations. The most important day of your life is when you truly begin to know yourself."
You're not your job. You're not how much money you have in the bank. You're not the car you drive. You're not the contents of your wallet. You're not your fucking khakis.
So welcome you spiritual entrepreneurs. Welcome you Johnny Cash Bodhisattvas. You revenge of the myth on your oppressors, as Gershom Scholem call the Kabbalah. And welcome you grunge Orpheuses. Are you ready for a near-life experience?
We are things that labor under the illusion of having a self. This accretion of sensory experience and feeling. Programmed with total assurance that we are each somebody, when in fact everybody's nobody.
As mentioned, on this early July, the year of our Demiurge 2016, right after our country celebrated becoming the latest hologram of the empire that never ended, we have the radioactive pleasure of being joined by Richard Carrier. As mentioned also, it's our latest of the series on the Christ myth theory and its problems. Based on Richard's latest work on the historicity of Jesus. Richard is certainly a prominent scholar on the Mythicist movement and a prominent scholar in general when it comes to ancient religions. Dude is a brilliant mortal and a great guy to hang out with, as I had the pleasure of doing so in last March Buzz Belief debate in Wisconsin, sponsored by my friends of Mythicist Milwaukee. Hello, Sean and Fritz.
We have to extricate the truth from this unbeliever on pain of torture.
As many of you might know, the Atheist Plus movement, in all its politically correct fury, is trying to bring Richard down. But we'll see how it plays out, and my shekels are on Richard weathering this Bolshevik storm. In any event, for more information on Richard, please visit richardcarrier.info.
I'm not the Messiah!
Check out our other episodes on the Christ myth theory and its problems, with such astral guests as Robert Price, David Fitzgerald, and Raphael Lataster. All found on YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, or our archive of past shows. We also have several satellite episodes on mythicism, for and against, including those with my dear and departed friend, Acharia S., and also with Tim Freak, Hector Avalos, and Tom Harper, just to name a few. Sure, we might do others in the future, but Richard's book is so spanning and complete, perhaps there will be no reason. We shall see.
Lois, don't get alarmed, but I think I might be Jesus.
Yes, it's no secret knowledge I'm a mythicist. But it's not my dogma, even after my karma ran over it. To me, and I've said it in past shows, Jesus as a mythical character unleashes and unlocks the power of myth that gets me doing the Macarena right into the world of liberating archetypes. And just like the ancient Gnostics, I'm all about a theoretical Jesus that, well, unleashes and unlocks the power of myth in any individual. Like John Lundwall said recently on the show, the study of mythology is all about the historicity of the eternal present. At the very least, the Christ myth theory should be a viable avenue for Jesus scholarship in academia, among so many other theories out there, without anyone losing any sleep over it. If they find the body, I certainly won't lose any sleep. Maybe I'm wrong, and Jesus is as historical as Buddha, Krishna, the gospel of Jesus' wife, or the many bin Ladens killed.
I give you the Bloody Christ.
Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition.
Please support Aeon by Gnostic Radio in any way you can. A few shekels here or there. If you find value in this or any content we put out at thegodabovegod.com, consider becoming a regular supporter via Patreon, PayPal, or finding virgins for sacrifices. Your support solely keeps this Red Pill cafeteria open. Much appreciation to you soul tomb raiders who support this blasphemy on a weekly basis. You make this venture possible and actualize, as we do so many wonders together and master that self-knowledge. And a shout out to other alternative podcasters out there like Talk Gnosis, Rune Soup, A Cult of Personality, Skeptico, and, of course, Mythicist Milwaukee.
A new age has begun. An age of freedom!
But enough of my Pandoric drivel and cosmic palaver. Let us do the interview with Richard Carrier on his latest book, On the Historicity of Jesus. Write your own gospel. Live your own myth. Welcome to the most important day of your life. Welcome to your last temptation.
You cried, so I came.
I didn't call for you. Who are you?
Your spirit.
My spirit.
You're afraid of being alone. You're just like Adam. He called me and I took one of his ribs and made it into a woman.
You're here to trick me.
Trick you? Why are you trying to save the world? Aren't your own sins enough for you? What arrogance to think you can save the world. The world doesn't have to be saved. Save yourself.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of having back Richard Carrier to discuss his book on the historicity of Jesus as well as the Christ myth theory in general. How are you doing today, Richard?
Doing great.
Thanks for joining us. So, I really enjoyed your book. It was definitely an encompassing and spanning book, probably a book that might be necessary with all the Christ myth theories that are out there. And it seems you bring something that is called the minimal Jesus myth theory. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, sure. Now, it's not really what it begins, of course, with Earl Doherty's book, The Jesus Puzzle. And there have been many scholars the last 100 years who have proposed alternative theories for how Christianity began without a historical Jesus. And the idea is that a historical Jesus was created as a sort of figure around which they could accumulate their myths and their teachings and things like that. But the first time someone came up with a theory that actually kind of fit the evidence and actually made sense in context was Earl Doherty's theory, wherein, if you read the letters of Paul, it sounds like he's talking about a revelatory being, some sort of archangel that appeared to them and told them that all of these things had happened in a mythical realm, or say a celestial realm. It didn't happen on earth. The crucifixion and burial and all of that were things that went on. It was a battle between Jesus and the devil and his demons and things like that. This does make sense in context. We actually have some evidence that there were Christians who taught something like this. And but of course, what he did is then he sort of expanded on that with a bunch of other theories about the development of the Q document and things like this. What I did is, in creating a book that would pass peer review at a major respected biblical studies press, is strip the theory down to its just bare minimum and not have all the extra hypotheses. Whether they're true or not, it's a whole separate question. But just get it down to its bare idea that there was this revelatory being who taught that these events happened in the celestial realm, and then later he was turned into a historical figure walking around Galilee, and then there was a sect that believed that was the true one, or was teaching that was the true story amongst the battles among sects at the time, and that sect is the one that gained essentially ultimate power in the long run, because they had a man teaching the right emperor at the right time in a civil war and so on, as we all know the story of Constantine. And so they then decided which documents to preserve and which ones to let go. And so the history of Christianity has been distorted by this one sectarian view of how things work. So that's the minimal theory, is this minimal idea that it being starting with a revelatory being, or at least that's what they were originally preaching, and it being turned into a historical figure later. And one can then speculate as to all the other reasons why all this had happened or other details of this, but I think it's better to just focus on, does this core theory by itself explain the evidence better than the traditional assumption that there was an actual historical Jesus? And I think overall it does.
Yeah, like you, I had been very much into the Christ myth theory years ago, and I'd read all these different ones, and I really enjoyed Earl Doherty. And in your book, you talk about how you had a bit of resistance. It's like, oh my God, here's some quack book that somebody's giving me, and you read it, and you said, this really gets into the mind of Paul. And your book explains very well what was going on in those days. I mean, for example, most people still, and this is an argument that secularists and Jews use, they say, well, you silly Christians, the Messiah was going to be a political Messiah. The Messiah, it was going to be the red calf and all this other stuff. But as you argue, in those days, it was perfectly fine to believe that we would have a spiritual Messiah.
It certainly is not out of character with other ways of thinking about the world. Now, you have to remember that the Christians, even from the very beginning and still to this day, still do preach the exact same Messiah as the political Messiah, right? That Jesus is still going to come down from heaven and rain fire on all his enemies, right? That's still going to happen. So the question is not a difference between a spiritual Messiah and an actual military victorious Messiah. The difference is between the stages of the messianic victory. Do they include an actual, sort of a momentary sacrificial death and then return? Does that fit into the storyline? And we have examples of this being the case. Even in the Talmud, so the Talmudic rabbis wrote regarding Isaiah 52 and 53, which is what the Christians cite as one of their seminal texts, that telling them, or God was putting a secret message in the text, they say, regarding this dying and rising Messiah who atones for all sins. But the rabbinical Jews agreed that this was, in fact, a secret message from God about the future Messiah. And in their scheme, they said that there are actually going to be two Messiahs. There's going to be the Messiah of Joseph, and then the son of Joseph, and there's going to be Messiah, son of David. And the Messiah, son of Joseph, he will die. He'll get killed by his enemies. And then the Messiah, son of David, will come and resurrect him, and then we'll have the end of the world. when you look at this, and we have hints of this dual Messiah system in the Dead Sea Scrolls too. It's nothing absolutely concrete, but there's a lot of little clues that they were talking about two different Messiahs, a priestly Messiah and a kingly Messiah. So there seems to be this two Messiah theory going on in Judaism for a very long time. And what the Christians did is they just combined them. They, instead of having it being two different guys, they'll just have the same guy. Since he's going to get resurrected, he can just be the same guy and just come back. And so that's, you see from very early on, even, in the teachings of Paul, and then, after, that was their assumption, is that Jesus came, died, and now he's just waiting, biding his time to come back and be the victorious Messiah. But of course, the sacrificial death, made him victorious over the spiritual forces of the world. So he actually triumphed over death and Satan and the demons and so on. And this granted Christians the ability to expel demons and things like that. So it gave them power over the demonic world. And so this is the very earliest Christian teaching. So when you look at it, it's really just the merging of two figures that were already in certain strands of rabbinical Judaism. So it's not a stretch to see a Jewish sect come up with this. And Christianity did begin as a Jewish sect.
And as you write, they weren't doing a Osiris cult 2.0, but is it sensible to say that Paul created a Jewish mystery religion? And as you point out, Clement of Alexandria agrees with this.
Yes, Clement is and Origen and other later Christian authors, even if they don't say it outright, they pretty much what they describe as the Christianity they know and the Christianity they think Paul taught. They're describing it as just like a mystery religion. And for people who don't know what that is, there was a whole fashion, a big trend at the time of these so-called mystery religions, and they all had a similar model. Now, they're all different from each other. They have lots of differences. Their hero story has lots of differences, and the religions have lots of differences. But those differences represent the national character of the specific culture from which the mystery religion arose. So the Egyptian mystery religion, which is the Osiris cult, Isis and Osiris cult, differed from the Hellenistic ones or the Turkish ones, and so on. Mithraism, for example, was a Persian, Roman-Persian religion. So when you look at the differences, they're explained by the national culture they came from. And so the Jewish mystery religion will have its Jewish elements. It will differ from the others in the same way. But what they all had in common with this basic idea that there was this set of mysteries that people get initiated into them and are taught them in secret. And when you learn them, they contain keys or clues or means in order to gain basically a favorable position in the afterlife. And these were personal salvation cults. You chose as an individual to join. When you joined, you became part of a fictive kin group. So you actually became part of a fraternity. Your fellow initiates were your brothers and sisters, just like the Christians said. You would engage in sacred meals that would create communion between you and your God. So basically just like the Eucharist. Now all these sacred meals differed from cult to cult, but the basic idea that you would have this communal meal and it would cause communion between you and your God and therefore help in your procuring salvation, that was a common feature throughout the mystery religions. And most or possibly all of them, but certainly many of them had baptism as part of their initiation ritual. And the baptism in some cases was actually a ritual symbolic death and resurrection. We know this for the Osiris cult it was, for example, where you were actually participating in an act that made you resemble and participate in the death and resurrection of the Savior God. Many of these mystery religions had dying and rising Savior gods. They're always the Son of God, occasionally the Daughter of God. Not all of them have dying gods. Mithraism, there's no evidence that Mithras was a dying and rising god, but he did have a passion, a paschon. There's a passion of Mithras in the story that we don't have the actual Gospels of Mithraism. They existed, but we don't have them. But we have clues enough to tell that he underwent some sort of great suffering or struggle, and that's what passion means, is a suffering, a sort of suffering or struggle. He undergoes some sort of great suffering through which he gained victory over death that he can share with his individual believers. And so that's the common thread there. So even though he's not a dying and rising God, he still fits the model of the whole basic idea that the Savior figure has to suffer something. He has to endure some indignity or something, so endure pain or something, or death, as the case may be. And that's how he gains power over everything that he can then share with his followers. And so these were common features, and there are other common features, but these are the main ones across the mystery religions. And Christianity ticks off every single item on the list. So it definitely was a mystery religion. I don't think it was invented by Paul, however. I think Paul Paul made changes to it. I mean, he got involved in it and actually took it in a different direction. But it looks like the religion, as a sect, the idea of the Christian sect teaching the dying and that the Savior had actually undergone a death and resurrection. That's kind of what distinguishes the Christian sect from other Jewish sects. That began, it appears, with Peter and possibly certain others of the earliest apostles a few years before Paul joined the movement. And so they seem to have started it. Now, it's entirely possible that they were already a Jewish sect that was already a mystery religion. We have evidence in Josephus, for example, that the Essenes had certain subsects that were comporting themselves just like mystery religions. So there appear to have been already Jewish mystery religions before Christianity. And the Essenes have a lot in common with Christians. There's a lot of similarities. And you see similarities also in the Dead Sea sect. So it's possible they were already a mystery religion teaching that this was going to happen, and then what you had was a leader who finally had this revelation, conveniently or not, to say that, what, it actually has just happened, and so let's reinvigorate our cult by this new event has occurred. Let's spread the good news, and the world is ending anytime now. Let's do this. So I suspect actually Christianity began as a mystery religion even before it was Christianity, and that it just sort of evolved into this new stage of the doctrine. And we have evidence, for example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls of sects like this that were very soon trying to calculate the date of when this Messiah would come. And there are even hints possibly that they expected some sort of death or certainly some sort of suffering that this Messiah would endure as part of the process. So I can totally see that there may have been a Jewish sect doing this stuff, like trying to anticipate when this is going to happen. And then you have one particular leader like Peter, probably according to the evidence we have in Paul. Peter probably had the first sort of dream or revelation that just convinced him, Eureka, you know what, this is the time is now, it's actually happened. And then that actually started what we call the Christian sectarian movement.
At the risk of not going into a paralomania, as David Fitzgerald calls it, is the idea of being crucified on a cross prevalent with these religions? As you point out in your book, Richard, even Inanna was placed in a cross when she went down into the underworld, into her passion. Is this something we can say was a trope of these movements?
Not crucifixion per se. And even Inanna, it doesn't mention her being crucified, for example, on a cross. But then this is all very, for example, it's unlikely that even Jesus, had he existed, that he was crucified on a cross as we understand it. He would have been crucified most likely on a T-shape. The crucifixion technology of the time, the most common one, was to use a certain kind of vine prop, and it was actually a T figure, so that you'd have a pole and you'd have another pole sitting on top of that pole, which is not a cross, it's a T. So even talking about that, and then being crucified, you can talk about what exactly constitutes a crucifixion and so on. In Inanna's case, this is the clearest case where we have she's killed and her naked body is nailed up, and so that's a crucifixion in the sense that she wasn't killed by the crucifixion, but she was crucified. And that was a common method of crucifixion. In fact, it was the method of crucifixion used by the rabbinical Jews. It's actually out of the Mishnah, that the same thing. And no matter what method of execution you used, whether it was stoning or beheading or whatever, you were also to hang up or nail up the body on a tree or platform, a wooden platform, for public display until the sun went down. And before the sun went down, you were to bury the body. And this was all basically to advertise the shame of the person. So crucifixion was even a feature of Jewish law and execution methodologies. It's just you weren't executed by crucifixion, your dead body was crucified after execution. Now, if you look at the other dying and rising gods, they die by different means. We know gods who were killed by being chopped up, gods who were killed by being stabbed by a boar. There's a god who's killed by castrating himself and bleeding to death. So the methods, when we look at the dying and rising gods, the methods by which they die vary. And we have the example of Zalmoxis, where he's just presumed dead. It's not even discussed what the method of killing him was, and he wasn't crucified by any account. So there are many different ways that they die, and different ways that they are resurrected. So the stories vary from hero to hero. So I think what we see in the Christian case is this merger of both the well-known Roman technology, which actually goes back to the Assyrians, so it's actually an old biblical technology, or technology known in the Bible, of how you crucify people, how awful people crucify people. And it's also a part of Jewish legal culture, too, in terms of how you crucify people. So this is when Christianity arose. If they're going to talk about how would the devil kill Jesus in the celestial realm, well, he would do it in the most extreme and humiliating way possible that was known to them, search their minds culturally for what that is, and they get a crucifixion. And there were biblical texts that supported this, Psalms 22 and passages in Isaiah, which suggest the same thing, which is that the Messiah would be pierced in some fashion, pierced or hung up in some fashion. And when you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, certain of these verses in the Hebrew form that's available in there actually is more explicit about the future Messiah being pierced or in that sense. So that it really would evoke in the imagination of the time that the Messiah was going to be crucified somehow.
And another trope that you address, and that is the idea that Peter, and as you're saying, he might have been the founder or one of the main guys of this mystery religion, that he was basically somebody who couldn't read or write, much like Muhammad. But if he was the founder of this religion, he probably could read or write, and he probably was not the dim-witted fellow we've come to know him as. Never gets anything. Yeah,
I'm quite certain of that. I can't say if it's unprecedented, but it's rarely. I can't even think of an example. That's how unprecedented it is. Maybe there is some weird, obscure example, but it's basically unprecedented for any religion like this to be founded by an illiterate person. That just doesn't happen in the history of religions. So you should be suspicious on that grounds alone. Secondly, this is a sect and a sectarian split that's heavily based on intense and scholarly reading of the scriptures from day one. So. It's extremely unlikely that some illiterate person started this religion. It had to be someone with extensive rabbinical teaching and knowledge. So it had to be someone literate. And when you look at the letters of Paul really does struggle to establish his authority next to theirs. It's clear that he's literate and that he can read the scriptures. If he could read the scriptures and these other guys could not even read the scriptures, that would have been one of the most powerful arguments he could have made for why he's a more important and capable authority than they are. He can actually read the scriptures. He actually has access to the thoughts of God and the messages of God in scripture. He never makes that argument. He always assumes that they're his equal in terms of their ability to interpret scripture or be authorities as, in the sense, be authorities within a scriptural-based religion. So it's very clear that Paul assumes that these guys are just as literate and scholarly and educated as he is. And there's no evidence in the letters, of course, that they were otherwise. So I think this idea that they were illiterate hicks that you get in the Gospels and then in Acts, I think that's a trumped-up myth. That's a legend that was created. Could be created for a number of different reasons. I mean, you have the example you mentioned that I mentioned is Muhammad, where it's often claimed that Muhammad was illiterate, therefore it's miraculous that he could write the Quran. But Muhammad was the son of one of basically the wealthiest mercantile family in Arabia. It's extremely unlikely that he would have been illiterate. But the myth that he was illiterate was created to make his ascension to power and his writing of the Quran more miraculous. We have other examples of that, like Joseph Smith actually had more education than is often let on in the history of Mormonism. And in order to make it look like he couldn't possibly have made up this religion, he just wasn't that educated. Like, he actually was kind of educated enough to do what he did. I think that's a common trend. And I think there could also be reasons to make them illiterate for other purposes in terms of selling it to the lower classes. The lower classes often had a disdain for the educated elite. There was basically class warfare at the time. So if you represented your founders as being like the local yokels, they'll be more likely to accept your religion than if you say that they were these super educated rabbis who are talking down to them. So there are many possible motives for creating the myth and the legend that the first apostles were illiterate, but the evidence and the precedent of history just make it highly unlikely that they were illiterate.
Yeah, we see the same thing with politicians. Trump and Hillary want to be just like the common man if they want their votes, but we know neither one of them is common, or they're definitely very elite. And so, Richard, let's look at some of the arguments in the first century as this mystery religion coalesced. One of the arguments that people use is absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. What do you say to this argument? I mean, you write that either all the evidence of Jesus was lost or suppressed because nobody knew about this religion, or either no one cared about Jesus or they lost everything. What do you say to that argument?
Actually, I formally analyzed the logic of that argument in my earlier book, Proving History, which is about Proving History, subtitle Bayes' Theorem and the Quest for the Historical Jesus. That book is all about the methodology, and it's about those particular kinds of questions. Is that a sound methodology? And when it's not, if it's not, when is it not? And so I have a whole section in there on when it is true that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but also when it is true that absence of evidence is evidence of absence, and it is, and there's in certain circumstances it is. So I talk about the methodology there for people who are interested in when that applies and when it doesn't. But in the book on the historicity of Jesus, where I apply this, I find both situations to exist for different kinds of evidence. So, for example, in the case of the letters of Paul, we very definitely should expect a lot more evidence of a historical earthly Jesus in the letters of Paul. We're talking 20,000 words where he never mentions this guy ever being on earth or walking around, never mentions anyone having met him in person. So it's before his death, let's put it that way. There are many other aspects of it that are very strange, and I have a whole chapter on this, in comparing it to other examples where people were very interested in recent historical figures of importance, and their historicity and the things they said and did in life are crucial arguments in the formation of the religion when you're trying to establish authority and answer arguments and disputes in your church, like Paul was. So the complete absence of this Galilean Nazarene earthly Jesus in the letters of Paul does go against expectation, and consequently it lowers the probability of a historicity of Jesus. It's a very significant absence of evidence, a very startling absence of evidence, in fact. But when you get to the other side, for example, the question of why don't other historians of the era record Jesus, that's easily answered if you accept that the Gospels hugely exaggerate his fame. And that's easy to accept. It's easy to say that, like Josephus, he records, let's say, like 6 messianic figures. And he definitely did not mention Jesus, despite the 2 passages that people claim were written by him. It's certainly not. We could talk about that later if you're interested. But he does mention other messianic figures. And notably, the passages that were inserted talking about Jesus do not sound at all like the other ways Josephus talks about messianic figures. So that's one clue why we know he didn't write it. But he does talk about these other guys. And say, well, how did they enter history? They got his attention, but Jesus didn't. And you can say, well, there might have been like 10 or 20 of these guys. And Josephus just recorded the most famous 6. If Jesus was like number 7 or number 10 or number 12, he just wouldn't be on the radar, right, of history. So we don't expect Jesus to be in the historians of the period. And so that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So we can't really use that as an argument. It only becomes an argument if you insist that the Gospels are literally true and totally inerrant. Because then with the scale of fame that Jesus is represented as having in the Gospels is so great that we would certainly expect him to be mentioned in many historians of the period. So in that case, that hypothesis is definitely refuted by that absence of evidence, because in that case, we do expect evidence.
And what about, for the layperson, Richard, what about the idea of primary source material? What is that, again, just for the layperson so they understand?
Well, that terminology is used differently in different contexts, so there's no real standard way of talking about it. The way I use primary source material, and I define this in my book, is the primary source material is the earliest survive. If you look at the chain of evidence, the earliest piece of that chain that survives is primary evidence. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's an eyewitness account. Some people only want to count as primary evidence eyewitness accounts, in which case we have 0 primary evidence for Jesus. All the evidence is secondary. But in my definition of primary, anything like if you have someone talking about having seen something in a document and they're writing in like 150 AD and we don't have the document they're talking about, the 150 AD report about that document is our primary evidence, but it's our primary evidence regarding what was in this other earlier lost document. So you can work with history that way, although you have to acknowledge that you're dealing with layers of potential distortion and error and so on. It makes it very difficult to do history for the ancient world, but ancient historians are quite comfortable with that because they're used to that.
And Richard, it seems one of the biggest evidence for Jesus being mythological are the Gospels themselves. I mean, aren't, as you point out, they're very genre makes them something that is very far away from history?
Yeah, absolutely. And there have been attempts by Christian apologists to argue that, no, they look just like biographies, therefore they're just like biographies. They actually aren't. They don't look at all like historiographic biographies of the time. They have certain features that resemble biographies, but only when you include mythic biographies. So, for example, we have lots of biographies of non-existent people. We have biography of Romulus, we have the biography of Theseus, we have biographies, there were written biographies of people like Hercules and things like that. There were stories that are just like the Gospels about Osiris, and Osiris is not a historical person. So this idea that the Gospels are just like biographies is only true when you include mythic biographies, so that doesn't answer the question, are these biographies like historical biographies, or are they like mythic biographies? And when you look at the most reliable historiographic biographies, they actually talk about their sources, they cite sources, they mention where they get their information, they engage in a historiographical method. And this is true even in Suetonius. When Suetonius writes biographies, Suetonius is one of the most gossipy of the biographers. Like, in other words, historians are often very, take his biographies with a grain of salt. Even he cites and discusses source materials and how he knows what he knows. Even he has a historiographic consciousness in his book. But the Gospels have no historiographical consciousness at all. They never talk about who said what when. They never talk about difficulty of comparing different sources. They never talk about there being alternative accounts and how they decided between them. They just tell a story. And moreover, they just tell a story and don't even tell you that they're copying part of the story from someone else. We have the example of like Matthew, where Matthew copies Mark, changes the stories of Mark considerably in many places, and neglects to tell you that he has done this, that there's an earlier version of the story that conflicts with his. No, he just rewrites the story and is selling his as the true story. This is what happens when you're creating redactions of mythography. This is not what you do when you're trying to be a judicious historian and figure out what the truth is, what actually happened in history, and communicate it to the public. The Gospels are not being written that way. The Gospels are being written with a very literary, allegorical content. And you can see this in the stories, the ridiculous things and improbable things that happen in them, the strange symbolic way they're organized. I talk about this in many aspects in Chapter 10 of On the Historicity of Jesus.
Yeah, you certainly cover a lot of ground in your book, and as you write, I mean, this wasn't uncommon. People, churches, and movement wanted to create a myth around which these churches could seek a common unity. We do it all the time. George Washington cut the tree. Reagan shrank the government. These are just mythic themes, so we can find a place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I give examples in that chapter on how the Gospels appear to be written in terms of how they're meant to be used. And they differ over time. The Gospel of John, I think, was written for a very different purpose than the earlier Gospels. But you have like the Gospel of Mark, it's clear that there are multiple functions being served by it, and one of which is, it is a manual. In total, it's a manual for missionaries to use in their mission. And what it does is it gives them convenient stories that they can use to tell and communicate the gospel. And it gives them convenient stories to use to explain the rituals of the religion, to explain the theology of the religion, and also to deal with naysayers. So, for example, Mark has many scenes in which Jesus has to handle some sort of challenge to his authority, where they'll say, like, you're insane, or you're in league with the devil. And then they give Jesus pithy replies, and I mean, it's highly unrealistic, where they don't even argue back, and somehow his pithy reply, which is often not even very good, wins the day. And then, so now a missionary has this story. So if someone challenges a missionary and says these things to him, like, you're crazy, or you're in league with the devil, you can say, well, they said that about the Savior, let me tell you the story. And then that allows them to use the pithy saying back at them. And they have this authority of this story, this sort of myth that helps them frame the whole debate now and say, like, and throw it back on the accuser. So the gospel contains a lot of useful tools for that purpose, and it seems well designed for that function. And so the stories are being made up to serve these purposes. It's essentially, whoever wrote Mark was probably looking at the problems and challenges of missionaries and saying, you know what, if we need, these are the problems we need to solve, these are the tools we need to give our missionaries, let me write a story and I'll put all this stuff in it, and now they can use all that material. And I think that looks very much like how the Gospel of Mark was originally being used. And then Matthew and Luke are essentially rewrites of Mark to try and recreate things the way they wanted them to be because they disagreed with certain aspects of Mark. I think Luke wanted to disagree with both Mark and Matthew. Matthew wanted to disagree with Mark. And then though the Synoptic Gospels represent this sort of people's different ways of writing, the missionary manual, as it were. John's a whole outlier, has completely different goals, I think. But I talk about that in the book.
Most people believe, or most scholars have accepted, that Luke heavily relies on Josephus, both in Acts and in his Gospel. But you point out that even Mark relies on Josephus, and basically he almost wrote it as a response to the Jewish wars.
Yeah, many scholars believe so. Now, we have to make a distinction. Luke Acts heavily relied on the antiquities of Josephus, and we can show many parallels, and even mistakes that Luke makes can be explained by his use of Josephus, the antiquities. Now, the antiquities was written in the 90s AD, so that places Luke post-90s, or at least late 90s at the earliest. Mark, however, does not show any signs of using the antiquities of Josephus. There's one incident in Mark where it looks like he's using a story that was published in the Jewish War of Josephus, which was an earlier book that Josephus wrote in the 70s AD, just after the Jewish War. And that's the Jesus ben Ananias story. And this has been published under peer review by various scholars who've noted this. But, and I talk about this on the Historicity of Jesus and cite the scholarship. And it looks like the crucifixion narrative is hung on a skeleton of the story of Jesus ben Ananias. Jesus ben Ananias was another Jesus, another apocalyptic prophetic figure, but he lived and died in the 60s AD, just before and during the war. And so clearly not our Jesus. This wasn't the Jesus that Christianity was inspired by at all. But Mark knew his story and knew it well enough that when he structured his crucifixion narrative for his Jesus, the Jesus he wanted to tell, he borrowed a lot of material and concepts from this other Jesus' story. And it's possible that he knows the story independently of Josephus. I think it's more likely that he got it from Josephus. Either way, the date that puts Mark is about the same, because the events of Jesus ben Ananias, that story was in the mid-60s AD, and Josephus wrote in the mid-70s. Everyone pretty much agrees, who's not a fundamentalist anyway, well, there's some exceptions, that Mark wrote after 70 AD. So whether he got it independently of Josephus or from Josephus doesn't really matter a huge amount for the dating. But it does show that he's responding to the war. And there are many other passages in Mark, not just Mark 13, which everyone focuses on as somehow, retrodicting the prediction of the Roman destruction of the temple. There are other aspects of the Gospel of Mark that show that Mark is responding to the Jewish war, and not merely responding to the Jewish war, but trying to explain two facts that don't make any sense. One is, why would God let the heathens come and destroy his own temple? And two, even if he were to allow that, why didn't he end the world? Why did that not end the world? Why is everything just going on as it always was? Why does it look like God is completely powerless and hasn't done anything or responded to this at all? Why has that happened? And that was a profoundly difficult question to answer, certainly for Messianic Jews, even for Jews in general, but certainly for Messianic Jews. And even more so for the Christians, who are expecting the world to end any time now. And by the time Mark is writing, most of the Christians were dead, right? The original Christians were dead. People were on the end of their lifespans, essentially. It's like, why hasn't the world happened? So there are elements of the Gospel of Mark that are designed to help missionaries answer this question. And the one example that I talk about, and again drawing from the existing peer-reviewed literature in Historicity of Jesus, is the fig tree incident. The Jesus hates figs story, where this makes no sense as history. It's obviously, this is a myth that Mark is writing about Jesus, but that leaves us the question of, like, what is the point of this weird-ass myth? What is he saying? And R.G. Hamilton Kelly really nails it in his literary analysis of this. And it's very clear that the way Mark has told and structured the story, that fig tree story is the answer that missionaries are supposed to give to this question. Why did God allow the temple to be destroyed by heathens? And why did that not end the world? And the answer is basically that God decided that the temple cult was corrupt, and that it was no longer the season for that tree to bear fruit anymore. So he cursed it and withered it to its very roots, just like the fig tree. And now we don't need the temple. We act through prayer. And by the way, the end is coming anytime now. But it's not right away because we still have a mission we still have to try and save everybody. So the story is designed to answer this catastrophic thing that happened that they couldn't explain. And there are many other examples of that where it's clear Mark is writing after the war and it is a response to the war. And in many ways, possibly the need of a new missionary manual was itself generated by the fact of the war, because the end of the Jewish temple meant the entire system of salvation that Jewish religion was based on required the temple cult to exist. So now the entirety of Judaism, the entire market for Jewish Christianity is in turmoil now, because there's no way for them to gain salvation. So the rabbis themselves had to reinvent some way to retool Judaism so that it is possible to atone for your sins and get resurrected and enjoy paradise in the end of the world without a temple. And so the Christians are they're now in this market with the same upheaval to deal with. So they needed a new way of evangelizing people that would take advantage of or respond to this huge event in Jewish history.
And continuing with the literary motifs, as you point out, Luke uses Homer for Acts, and that's drawing on the great work of Dennis MacDonald. And he also uses the Bacchae. But this was not uncommon in those days, Richard. I mean, you were going to draw upon the zeitgeist of the times, would have been Homer and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. Not every parallel that Dennis MacDonald argues for, I think, holds up. Or at least we can't know for sure. But he does have enough examples that are very clear that I think do hold up, so that the general point is definitely established, that both Mark and Luke relied on Homeric models for the construction of their mythologies. And what they're doing is they're rewriting the Homeric models, updating them in time. It's kind of like the way you have Romeo and Juliet gets updated and becomes West Side Story, right? So you use use the basic models, you change some things, you make it modern. And you might even use it to communicate subtly different values. So you even have West Side Story has slightly different values being promoted or talked about than the original Romeo and Juliet story, because the values have changed or the message has changed. And so the Gospels are doing the same, the authors are doing the same thing, where they actually are competing against Homer as a set of values and models. And they want to argue that we have a better set of values and models. And so they rewrite Homeric stories with their own particular figures and in their own particular contexts. And they change them, and the way they change them is the message. Is the point. Is like, this is how our story is better than yours. This is why our story has better moral to the story than yours does, and so on. And so that's what they're doing. And Dennis MacDonald does a really good job of explaining this in all his books about the use of Homer in the Gospels. So that's definitely going on. They're also, however, heavily using the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And so not only are they using Homeric models, they're using Septuagintal models. So, for example, there are many instances in which stories about Moses and Elijah and Elisha are being retooled and being told about Jesus, essentially. So mythology of Jesus is being created out of these other mythic models, because the Christians also wanted to say that their message was different from conservative Judaism, that they had this new way of looking at it, claiming that this was the way God always meant things and that people had gotten the old stuff wrong. But they also want to have this new message like, look, no, things have changed. We're no longer like following strictly Moses. We're following Jesus. And so let's basically remake Jesus as the new Moses. And let's remake Jesus as the new Elijah. And the values that were promoted by the Elijah stories originally are contrary to what the values the Christians want to promote. So they take the models from Elijah, have Jesus do the things that Elijah did, but then change them up just enough to show how their Jesus differs from Elijah and how his values differ and how the message differs. And so they're doing that. They're using both Jewish and pagan models to create a mythology for themselves that defines who they are and what their message is.
Richard, last time you were on the show, it was after Bart Ehrman's Did Jesus Exist had been published, and you were disappointed because you thought you were looking for a book you could show your students to say, hey, here's the counter argument, let's tackle this.
Yeah.
Since then, is there any books it's a two-pronged question, any books you would recommend that puts a good case for the historical Jesus? And second, are there any arguments that you would say are good for the historical Jesus. For example, Robert Price he's come and said that the James Caliphate argument is pretty sound, that there was an early church around this figure called James, and he might have been the brother of Jesus or not been the brother of Jesus, but we do have this early church around James. What do you say to these two questions?
The first is no. I'm really surprised no one has come out with a decent book in defense of historicity. This should be doable. You should, even if I disagree with it, it should still be possible to put out a really good book, like the best book possible, defending the historicity of Jesus. After Ehrman's terrible book, the only thing that came out in defense of historicity was Maurice Casey's book, which was even worse than Bart Ehrman's book. I mean, even Christian apologists are like shaking their head in embarrassment at Maurice Casey's book because it's so bad. No, we don't have one, and there should be one. We need one. So someone who's a big expert in the field should really write a calm, well-reasoned defense of historicity. I want to see that happen. I'm still waiting for that to happen. On the other question, I don't agree with Price that that's even a plausible argument. When I looked at the history of the concept of James being a brother of Jesus, that all falls apart because the idea of James being a brother of Jesus is actually a rather late legend. It's a post-biblical legend. It's not even in the New Testament. People often don't realize that. They mention Jesus having brothers and they rattle off a list of names, but the Gospels are very clear in it, the way they present it is that they have no knowledge of any of those brothers, much less James, ever being a future leader of the church. In fact, they have Jesus renounce his family and establish the fictive kinship with his followers, and that's just a symbolic, like, you should get rid of your family and join our family because our family will save you. It's more important, and that's a very common myth that you would write for any kind of fictive kin group like Christianity or any other mystery religion, which is this idea that you need to shift allegiance from your biological family to your fictive kin group, your cult group, and so they have no knowledge of there ever being a James. They tell no stories about James, the brother of Jesus, having visions of Jesus or being with the apostles or anything like that at all, before or after the resurrection. When you get to the book of Acts, which tells, or at least purports to tell, a story of the first 30 years of the Christian religion, it's technically a history of the Christian church from the beginning to about the early 60s AD. It has no knowledge of any of the brothers of Jesus taking any leadership role in the church ever. There's no James, brother of Jesus, who's ever in charge of the church in the book of Acts. The author of the book of Acts has no knowledge of this ever being the case. So when do we have this idea of James ever being a leader of the church? It comes like 100 years later or more. It's not even 1 Clement, I'll point out. 1 Clement has no knowledge of James, the brother of Jesus, ever even existing, much less being a significant leader of the church. So, and that gets us, past the first century. So already we're in the 2nd century before we start seeing any legends about there being a brother of James that took any significant role in the church. So everything then comes down to one line in Paul where he says, I met Kephas, meaning Peter, and I met I didn't meet any apostles except I met James, the brother of the Lord. And so the debate then becomes, what does he mean by the brother of the Lord? Because all baptized Christians were brothers of the Lord because they were all adopted by God and became the sons of God and therefore became brothers of the Son of God, or the Son of God. So does he mean a baptized Christian or does he mean a biological brother? And that I think is the one focal point of the debate where historicity hangs or fails on that particular question, answering that one question. I think it's probably unanswerable at best, and I think at worst, I think the evidence trends towards Paul meaning a baptized Christian, not a biological brother. I point out the arguments and why I think it tips one way rather than the other on the historicity of Jesus. But even in my book on the historicity of Jesus, I run the numbers for both what I think the numbers are and for the furthest against me that I could imagine, that I can reasonably believe the numbers to be. And so I actually count the passage about James, the brother of the Lord, as being evidence for historicity. I actually give it weight and actually have it weigh and increase the probability of historicity. And still the math comes out as unlikely Jesus existed. So even if it's evidence, it's weak evidence because of this uncertainty, this uncertainty as to what Paul means. If Paul were much more clear, if he'd said like brother the brother of Jesus in the flesh, or if he'd said, the something like the biological brother of Jesus, or the brother who came from the family of Jesus, or something that was very clear, that would settle it. We would have to say that's very good evidence for historicity. It makes non-historicity highly unlikely. But no, what Paul says is extremely ambiguous, and that ambiguity has to be accounted for in any calculation you make.
Richard, I was reading a book a few weeks ago about Jesus, and the author said basically no reputed scholar believes that Jesus was a myth. Now, obviously, I'm talking to one right now. We have Robert Price, but don't you have a blog, or is it your blog, where you mentioned that this is not true? There are actually other scholars that are out there that have embraced the Christ myth theory?
It's a better way to phrase it is agnostics, right? So there are more scholars willing to say it's 50-50 rather than just saying, I think Jesus didn't exist. So it's a question of how many see this as a respectable theory, and depending on how you define that. So, in my article, Ehrman on Historicity Recap, it's an extensive recap summary article of all the debates I'd had with Bart Ehrman about this issue. Item 22 in there actually gives, and that I keep updating, by the way, as new people come forward. I include all of the experts in Christianity or ancient history who agree that it's at least 50-50 that we should be agnostic about the historicity of Jesus, or more. Some of them are going further than that and say it's unlikely that he existed, but at least to the point of saying he might not have existed. We should deal with that. And that includes Arthur Droge, Kurt Knoll, Thomas Brody, Thomas Thompson, myself, Robert Price, and Hector Avalos. So it's quite a number of us now. But even there are scholars who are on the side of historicity, so think Jesus existed, but who actually think that the non-existence hypothesis is at least respectable as any other hypothesis in the field regarding the historical Jesus, because the field has tremendous disagreement about who the original Jesus was. Was he a zealot and got whitewashed by mythology? Was he something else? How do you reconstruct the original historical Jesus? There are like a dozen different reconstructions of the historical Jesus, and some of them get increasingly ridiculous. If those are allowed to be respected in the field, then this idea that maybe he was a revelatory archangel, that's at least as plausible as these others, and should be allowed at the table as a viable hypothesis to debate. And there have been scholars who've said that. So, for example, Philip Davies has argued that and said that actually this is at least a respectable theory. We should take it seriously and include it with the same level of respect as all the other theories that we accept in the field, but also we might personally not agree with. So there's a lot more respectability for this theory than someone who says what you just quoted is letting on.
And moving in the theme of the show briefly, and we talked about this at the Buzz Believed event in Milwaukee by Mythicist Milwaukee. I talked about, or I mentioned to you, Richard, about why scholars never seem to sort of talk about the Gnostic Gospels in their arguments. And your answer was basically that it's so hard to date them. Until we find out when the Gospel of Thomas came out, we really can't make an argument either way, or for or against.
Yeah, it's a problem. Yeah, it would be so much nicer if we just were allowed to have all the Gospels that were written, right? If the Christians just wouldn't have destroyed evidence, right? If they should have just not, right? If they were just like honest and said like, all right, these were the Gospels that were written. This is when they were written. We reject these certain ones, but we're going to preserve them for historical purposes. No, they just outright destroyed all the Gospels that they didn't agree with, and making it extremely difficult to find them. In most cases, we only have fragments that survived, like in this one isolated monastery that preserved this one text, and then half of it rotted away or whatever. We rarely have complete texts. I think the Gospel of Judas, is roughly. I think we have the complete codex of the Gospel of Judas. I'm not sure of that. But that's one isolated example that has survived from the 2nd century. The 3rd century. The manuscript itself was written, actually created in the 3rd century and somehow survived somewhere all this time. I'm not sure the venue is actually, the provenance is actually known where it came from. But it's probably sitting in some, one library and one monastery somewhere on Earth all this time. And or we find the Nag Hammadi find, but that unfortunately those were buried, in the early Middle Ages. So that's not doesn't really help us. So we can't really date. Many of those documents may have been preserving texts that were written centuries earlier, but we can't know, and that's frustrating. If we had a Nag Hammadi burial that was dated to 90 AD, that would be awesome, because then we could say wow, this date 90 AD they were writing these things. That would be remarkable, and that would change the way we look at the history of Christianity for sure. But we just don't have anything like that, and that's frustrating.
But as you point out, we can draw some hypotheses or insights into it. For example, you write that we have two texts, Gnostos, the Blessed, and the Sophia of Jesus Christ. Doesn't that tell us there was a little bit of riffing going on then? Yeah, that's a good example. I love that one because it really shows proof of concept. It shows how it gives us a peek not only into the fact of how they were fabricating gospels, but that they were fabricating gospels, right? Because you can often just say, yeah, obviously they're fabricating this stuff, but it's one thing to say that it's obvious that they're doing it. It's another thing to actually find evidence of them doing it. And that's what we have in the case of this, where they were in the middle of creating the forgery they were creating a new gospel with a new resurrection narrative in which Jesus is having a conversation with his disciples. But everything Jesus says in this conversation is a direct quote from this other letter that comes from this figure called Gnostos. The words are not the words of Jesus. It has nothing, probably not even a Christian document. It's probably a Jewish Gnostic document. So they were just taking this letter, this traditional Gnostic letter, this pre-Christian, possibly Jewish mystical writing, and just borrowing words from it and putting them in the mouth of Jesus and fabricating a narrative in which Jesus said them. And we have this because they were in the middle of doing it, and so we can see that they were doing it. And that's astonishing and interesting. And it shows the kind of way this can happen. So when you look at the sayings of Jesus, it's easy to think that a lot of the sayings of Jesus come from other documents that were probably not even written by Christians, maybe even written before Christianity. They just liked certain lines. They picked them up, put them on the mouth of Jesus. And this could be the case in the canonical Gospels as well. So we can't – what we're looking at in the canonical Gospels is what the authors wanted Jesus to have said, not necessarily what Jesus ever actually said. And you've certainly written about how the Gospel of Jesus' wife is possibly a forgery. Have you read the New Atlantic piece that basically puts that to rest?
You know what? It's on my list. Yes,
you gotta read it.
I've been distracted. I just heard about it. I'm not the news is not surprising to me. It was very obvious that it was a fabrication, all along. I mean, the evidence that was being presented, but I was astonished at the resistance to the evidence of it being a fabrication. There should not have been that resistance. It should have been pretty much a slam dunk and said, you know what, this is obviously a forgery. So I'm delighted to go read that article eventually. I got to make a note to do that before I forget. But tell me about it.
Oh, well, basically, the journalist found the source that gave Karen King the document, and this guy is very jaded. We're talking he was an amateur porn director. He was a believer in the Da Vinci Code. It's more sensationalistic than a novel itself, Richard. When you read it, it's going to blow you away, and I think Karen King has basically disavowed it. I mean, it's freaky.
Wow. Okay, I'm very interested in this. This is funny because it reminds me a lot of something else that's going on in connection to my scholarship, which not related to Jesus, although it is related to the question of forgeries and transmission of documents. Is the one piece I did for German Studies Review in the field of Hitler studies, where I was asked originally by the Freedom from Religion Foundation to investigate there are these quotes in English about Hitler claiming to be an atheist and attacking Christianity and stuff, and they wanted me to investigate whether the translations were accurate and so on. And what I found was opened a rabbit hole of weirdness. And so I published an article showing that there are that the English translation's unreliable, that there's some sort of shenanigans going on, and sort of outlined the things that were going on and said more research is needed. And then Professor Mikael Nilsson of, I think, the University of Stockholm in Sweden picked this up and ran with it and is doing a total Dan Brown novel investigation of actually hunting people down, looking through their letter archives, trying to talk to family members and stuff like this, and has already uncovered some interesting things. Part of the story in that case was the English translation is actually a translation from the French translation. The French translation was made by this weird Nazi terrorist funder guy, François Genoud, who was a Swiss banker who was a money launderer for the Nazi loot from murdered Jewish families, and it's really terrible. But his French translation changes the German and makes Hitler sound like an atheist who's attacking Christianity. When you look at the original German, that's not what he's saying, something rather different. And now that's bizarre, but it's really bizarre. Why would the English translation come from the French? And the French only exists for certain passages, so they had access to the German, the whole German. But for the sections that there was a French translation of, they chose the French to translate from. It doesn't make any sense why they would do that. And one of the things Mikhail Nielsen found was that the original contract, because the German had been bought by this Nazi guy, so he owned the original German manuscript. So now there's questions as to how much of it he forged. Some of it not, some of it maybe. That's still being investigated. But in the contract he had with the publisher and the editor who produced the English translation, he mandated in the contract that they would only translate from the French for the sections that were in French. And that's a really weird request to make. It's an even weirder request to have conceded to. Like, there's no reason the editor should have agreed to that. And so there's a lot of these like weird things going on. And then also you found other aspects of it too, where the editor in later years started to be suspicious about this but never came forward about it publicly and things like that. So it's another one of these sort of like the stuff that falls out of the can of worms when someone starts digging is rather interesting.
Yeah, it just tells you they were doing it 2,000 years ago. They're doing it now. I mean, it's just human nature, man. It's romanticizing, yeah. Well, I think that's all the time we have today. Are you going to be joining us in October for the debate, the bus belief debate in Milwaukee?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Yeah,
awesome.
I believe I'll be there.
Oh, well, then we'll definitely see you there, and I'm sure I'll have more questions for you. Talk about the gospel of Jesus' wife some more.
Yeah, outstanding.
All right, well, thank you very much, Richard, for coming on Aeon Byte again and discussing your book on the historicity of Jesus.
Glad to be here. Anytime.